Hello, everyone. I'm John Lynn, the founder and chief editor at Healthcare IT Today. And today we have a special guest to talk about the hottest topic of the week, which is information blocking. And our guest is Mike Lipinski. He's Division Director of Regulatory and Policy Affairs Division at ONC. Welcome, Michael.
Hi, John. Excited to be here today. Talk to you about that topic, information blocking.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think everyone's talking about it. The deadline was yesterday as we record it. So, this will be published a few days later. But before we dive into that, tell us a little bit about yourself and your role at ONC.
Okay, well, came to ONC back when High Tech Act was passed. So I've been here a long time, since that was 2009. And I think I've had put pen to paper on every regulation that ONC has issued in that time, which has been quite a few. We've actually now posted a document on our website, so you can see every regulation that ONC issued, when we issued it and everything. So hopefully that's a great resource for folks. But anyhow, I've been, obviously, as I just said, working on regulations, but also we focus in my division, we have three branches, one that focuses on the development of our regulations, one that focuses on compliance and administration, and then another one that focuses on providing policy input to other regulations in the department. And that's, I think, pretty key, as you know, particularly with CMS payment rules, coordinating on, like, for example, HIPAA, with OCR. So that's a lot of the work that this division does, and I've been doing here for, I guess, now 12 years.
Yeah. I think you've been busy. Obviously, High Tech Act exploded the regulations around health IT. So you've been working hard for sure. And obviously, the latest regulation comes from the 21st Century Cures Act, which went into compliance. April 5th was the delay for many pieces of it. So what does this new compliance day mean for healthcare organizations? What should they be thinking about, and what should they have already done?
Well, we did put a blog out, yesterday, April 5th. So I encourage folks to take a look at that. That was authored by our national coordinator, Mickey Tripathi, and our deputy national coordinator, Steve Posnack. And so just to put that back on people's radar, right? And so now it is the effective date. It was a long process. I think our proposed rule was in February of 2018. And so we took a lot of feedback, as you know, and I think we're ready now, to hit the ground running. And I think it's like we like to say, a bold new day, opportunity for interoperability, opportunity to improve healthcare. And so that's how I think organizations should look at yesterday and going forward. So
Yeah.
that's the bottom line, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. It obviously got delayed because of COVID, which I think everyone thought was appropriate, and I think many thought it should have continued to be, but it wasn't, and so we're here. So if you're a healthcare organization that maybe thought that it was going to be delayed again, or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
or maybe you're just too busy with COVID, what would you say to those healthcare organizations that maybe aren't prepared for that deadline? What should they work on first that would really help them be in compliance?
Sure. But before I get to that, I think I want to just touch on the point you raised. Obviously the rule, if you want to go way back, we've issued in March of last year when everybody just first heard about COVID coming to the United States, and I think it was the right choice. First, we did enforcement discretion, then ultimately we moved the date, which was originally November to April 5th of this year. But I want to say, like, when we put out that interim final rule in November, we got equal amount of comments back suggesting that we shouldn't have even delayed it, and
Interesting.
definitely not to delay it any further, because the sharing of a lot of that data right now would have been helpful, we think, in this environment. The sharing of test results, getting that more easily accessible, things of that nature, sharing of immunization records amongst providers and with patients. So I think it goes both ways. So it was definitely a balancing act by us, coming up with where we are on the date. And to me, and I think to us, as you can see, since we went forward with this date, we think it was the right balance in the end. So we're here. So if you've been focused on other things, what should you do now? I think the first thing I would say is don't worry. It's not the earth, the earth isn't stop rotating today because of the information blocking reg. But there are, and you really should see it as a positive, right? So especially for a healthcare organization, there have been so many that we heard from through the rulemaking process, from before we even put out the proposed rule and through the comment period, was about a lot of specialists and small providers not being able to get the data from the
Yeah.
large healthcare organizations. So think of it as in a positive. This is now your opportunity to have more access to that EHI to improve care for your patients. So that's the first thing, I think, the way that I would think of it. The other thing is, and this kind of is, think about who you are and where you fit in the process. So obviously healthcare provider is a broad definition. So it's more than your normal hospital or, again, any type of physician practice. It's labs, it's pharmacies are covered, long-term post-acute care facilities like skilled nursing facilities. So know if you're covered, for one, and assume you're covered. Then you need to look at like your actions, right? So some of your actions might change how you're viewed under the information blocking regulation. For example, the health information network and health information exchange definition is a functional definition. So you may be acting as a HIN in certain instances if you're overseeing in your area network an HIE, and you're so in those instances it changes both your potential liability under the law. So then if you're a HIN, you're subject to civil monetary penalties issued by the HHS Office of Inspector General, and your knowledge, quote unquote, knowledge standard changes. And what am I talking about when I'm talking about a knowledge standard? It goes to, your intent with your practice. So it's a practice. I think it's actually also worth mentioning, how Congress defined it, because they defined it for us in the statute, right? And it was a overwhelming bipartisan, the Cures Act, right? And so they said it just had to likely interfere with or materially discourage and also prevent access, exchange, or use. So it wasn't like it had to be, it only had to likely be, and even materially discourage. So you have to keep that, I think, in the back of your mind in terms of your practices, right? It's not just a definitive, I didn't give them the data type of approach. And so back to the intent piece on that. So if you're a provider, it says you should have known your actions would lead to that, to a likely interference. If you're a developer or if you're a HIN, your actions are should have known. You should have known that what you're doing. So you can see there, it's a much lower standard if you're a HIN or a developer certified health IT. And there's a potential, the way the definition of developer is construed, that you can be a developer certified health IT because it's an offerer of certified health IT as well. So a provider could potentially meet one of the other two definitions. So I think that's first thing you need to look at what you are doing in the healthcare space, and could you potentially meet other definitions? Do you meet the healthcare provider definition first? And then two, could you possibly meet with some of your actions one of the other two definitions? And then after that, I think it's really like, thinking about the agreements that you have in place, I think are really the next step. And I think that's probably going to be the most challenging part for them, is they're used to the HIPAA construct of permissive, right? And now they need to be having policies in place, essentially demonstrating how they would meet preconditions and why they would not exchange, right? So we talked about in the rule that even a business associate agreement, why that it could be subject to review under information blocking, and that both parties to that business associate agreement could potentially be liable. And we would be looking at to see why did they not do what was a permissible disclosure. So whether it was patient access, whether it was treatment, so I think that's probably the other thing that I'd be looking at. First, definitions, and then second, looking at my agreements. and considering, from the why, why are they set up the way they are? Why am I not providing patient access if I'm participating in an HIE? Why am I not sharing with the local healthcare organization down the street? So those are the
Right.
things I think they would probably want to be taking a look at.
Yeah, and I agree with you on the agreement side. I'd written about that, and it's not that it's hard; it's just time consuming. I think anytime you deal with the agreements, in multiple parties, it takes time. So I think that's definitely a acute observation. You brought up something interesting that I think a lot of people don't understand about the rulemaking process. So, if you don't mind, I'd love to have you help us understand, people that aren't as intimately familiar with how this works. That,
Mhm.
when you're making a rule, I think I often hear people say, why did they do that? Why did ONC do that?
Right.
and I think sometimes it's done, that you specifically have an intent. Other times you're bound by the legislative, just like you just described. The legislative language says something, and so you're required to follow it. Could you tell us a little bit more about how, so you're bound by the legislation, you have feedback coming in, how does that process work? And
Sure.
what help people understand how that goes?
Yeah, I mean, particularly in this case, I mean, we don't probably want to go through a regulations 101. We could save that
Sure.
for another day. But in this case, Congress was explicit about what the expectations were of ONC and their understanding of what they thought information blocking was, right? So they gave us a definition in the statute. Um, they actually said that, that what we were really tasked and the secretary was tasked with was to identify reasonable and necessary activities that would not constitute information blocking.
Gotcha.
And that had to be done through notice and comment rulemaking, it's called. And that's done under what's called the Administrative Procedure Act. And it requires us to essentially put forth a proposal of how we would implement and identify those, what we identify are reasonable, necessary, and then take public comment. I think it's a great part of our government process is that there's this opportunity for its citizens to participate in the process to reach a law that's really going to govern them in the end. And so essentially that's what we did here. We actually started off in the beginning by talking and soliciting feedback from stakeholders, meeting with them to hear about what they were, seeing in practice and when it comes to what is information blocking. Then we put forth our proposals. We had what's called a comment period for what I was talking about for us to get feedback. We received over, I think, 2,000 submissions. So that's not 2,000 comments. That's 2,000 submissions, of which some are hundreds of pages of comments
Yeah.
we received from stakeholders. Took that all into consideration, talked with our federal partners. There's a review process in the government. First it starts with your department, then it goes to the whole federal government for review. There's even opportunity through that process for stakeholders to meet with what's called the Office of Management and Budget, and they can go and meet there, and we listen in, and they give some more feedback on the rule. And then ultimately we put that rule out, and then we give it an effective date. So in this case, we delayed the effective date, obviously, as we talked about due to COVID. But we also did some stuff with the policies to take into account that this was new law, and it was going to take some time for people to get used to it. And the blog that was issued yesterday points that out, because we've limited the what is called electronic health information that really needs to be accessible for exchange, access, and use. So it's called the USCDI. So it's a limited set of data and we're giving stakeholders 18 months to kind of get familiar with the new framework that they have to deal with, and try to provide more than that. We encourage them to provide all the EHI that's requested, but they're not going to be subject to any type of consequences on the regulation as long as they're providing at least the data that they have that's identified by the USCDI. So yeah, that's in a nutshell how that works, and what we did here with this rulemaking.
Yeah. And I think you point out another interesting thing that, we're all familiar with PHI, and I think we're all going to become familiar with EHI now under information blocking. Is that fair?
It is, but it's also it's good that you pointed that out, because I think we heard that from stakeholders. And this final rule definitely focused on alignment with HIPAA,
Mhm.
where it made sense. So when we define EHI, it's actually EHI equals EPHI, electronic protected health information, that is in the designated record set. So there's an alignment there. So I mean, we definitely heard from stakeholders, hey, am I going to have separate data that I have to keep in different silos? And obviously that's not what we're attempting to achieve here. So hopefully that, I think, resolved that concern. And so far, the feedback, I think, has been good in that space in terms of understanding what data we're talking about, and it's not some new or separate data than they're already um, have spent 20 years learning how to
Yeah.
protect and exchange.
That's good to hear. So there's been a lot of discussion around information blocking exceptions. Do you
Mhm.
expect those to kind of continue to evolve with ONC, offering more clarifications on what really is an exception, what isn't? I mean, I know you've already issued a number of FAQs, which I think were really helpful. Do you see that happening as well?
So I can probably say two things there. So definitely more guidance as needed. We're looking at the questions that come in. Um, I think you'll get what are called FAQs, frequently asked questions, and a response to those by exception and by topic is how we're doing it. So like, what's an
Okay.
interference? I think that's a big question. What's actually an interference? And the one we focused on most recently is like, what constitutes a delay, right? Like in getting access
Mhm.
to your EHI. And so, yes, I do think we'll keep doing that. But I think the bigger picture here is, so like I said, we were tasked with identifying reasonable and necessary activities. And I don't think that's a static process. I think the first thing is, we identified as of today what we thought were reasonable and necessary activities. We're going to see how the market, I think, approaches that. And,
Uh-huh.
what exceptions are they taking advantage of? Is there any gaps in any exceptions? Do exceptions need to be revised because they're creating disincentives, so to speak, in actions, right? Like, or maybe the one thing, that's going to change, besides everything, right? It changes, right? Definitely health IT, right? It's clearly
Sure.
gotten better through the years, right? Like,
Of course.
of course, we now standardized with FHIR before it wasn't ready back in 2015. Um, so we expect that to continue. And some of maybe we revisit some of the things that are in exceptions today because the market isn't capable of doing things with the health IT today that they'll be able to do in the future. But again, I think, you know, looking at the exceptions as a whole, I think they acknowledge where the market is today.
Yeah. No, I think there's a lot of, I mean, they're detailed, right? You guys put in the work that really mattered, and listen to a lot of comments, I'm sure, on the exceptions. So it makes sense. Well, it'll be interesting to see how they evolve. Um, how are you approaching reports of information blocking? I know
Mm.
you have a portal where anyone that's experienced information blocking can report it, and it falls under the same privacy conditions as other reporting. So it's a safe place that they can report. And will you be sharing those? I imagine HHS doesn't like the term wall of shame for the HIPAA wall of shame, although it's kind of colloquially used. Will there be a similar information blocking portal that shows everyone that's information blocking, or any thoughts going in there, as
I hope
far as
no one's
reporting?
ever on that. Yeah, that would be the
That
first
would be
hope, because
ideal.
I mean, seriously, I mean, the ultimate goal here isn't really to catch somebody, it's really to get the data moving, because the whole purpose of this is to improve the quality of care, so
Mhm.
that data is available when it's needed, but also hopefully even reduce the cost of care, right? The more, this data gets out, that may help it reduce even the cost of care. So, but assuming there are, we'll play hypothetical. Assuming there are bad actors, how do we approach that? So I'm happy you mentioned that information that's shared with us is protected. So because it's hard to do anything with an anonymous claim of information blocking,
Right.
but the identity of anybody who submits something through that portal is protected from disclosure under the Freedom of Information Act and so forth. So they should feel comfortable providing us with that information, which would be shared with the HHS Office of the Inspector General and potentially other federal agencies as appropriate. So yes, we encourage people to submit through there, but there's some overlap too, especially when it comes to developers of certified health IT. So ONC has a certification program. We certify those, the products of those developers, and then they're subject to our conditions and certification, one of which is information blocking, as you pointed out, and another's are like things that they have to do with their application programming interface. So I expect us to be strong with our oversight for the program, to make sure, if we get claims in and there's a basis behind those claims, to follow through. And what happens in those instances, which happens now with what our current certification bodies, when they certify health IT and find what are called non-conformities with the product, they do a notice to that developer, and then they put a corrective action plan, and it goes up on what is affectionately known as the chapel, but it's the Certified Health IT Products list.
Yep.
And so up there you can see, oh, there was something wrong with this product. Here's the plan to correct it. And then it tells you if it's been corrected. I think we'll be taking the same approach under the program for any non-compliance or non-conformities with our conditions of certification, which would include, there's a condition, it's 174.1, that no developer should information block. So, I think that's our approach, the standard approach that we've had before. The consequences on our program aren't, I don't know how to say it. They're not the same, I'll just say, as civil monetary penalties that can be up to $1 million for violation, which is what HHS OIG can issue, who also has authority over and jurisdiction over developers who may have committed information blocking. But under our program, it's, really our goal is to get them corrected with whatever they're doing. And, they could get kicked out of the program if they're an information blocker. That's,
Sure.
a potential consequence, but it isn't financial consequences from a actual levying of a fine, which can happen under OIG. It's hard for me to speak for OIG. As you know, they issued a rule last year on how they plan to proceed with their approach to the civil monetary penalties for information blocking. They're going to be issuing a final rule for that. I can't speak to the date, but I know that there's intent there to get that done as well. And so once that comes out, I imagine they will, and like they propose, will follow their current processes. And I know if there's ever a settlement, they make that public, what
Sure.
the allegations are and so forth. So I think you would see some of the similar processes that are already used for both under our program and that OIG uses will be how we'll probably approach the future with information blocking.
Yeah, and it's interesting that the intent is, it sounds, and these are my words, not yours. It's less about being punitive and more about pushing forward the information sharing, which is the goal of the program in general anyways. It's not trying to punish people. It's trying to incentivize the right thing, which is sharing patient data appropriately.
And I mean, just to spend a minute on that, I think, it's going to be anecdotal, but I think everybody wants to do that. Like, so we have been giving tons of presentations to, more the small practices, like through the state medical associations. We're happy to
Okay.
give them one-on-one presentations. And they, everybody seems to want to comply. They're just trying to figure out how do I do that?
Yeah.
And like, we like to try to, like I said, from the beginning, encourage them that like, this is an opportunity for you to get the data that you haven't been able to get. And you've come to us before and complained about that. And then honestly, on the developer side, I've heard good things. Like they are out there educating their consumers. So those are the providers on, what this means and how this changes things for them. And they've been very engaged with us to understand what the expectations are under the program. So far I've not heard, there are always certain like nefarious things people are still trying to do. Maybe try to get somebody to sign a contract today that says like, you won't come after me under infra blocking later. type of thing, which I guess, that's what attorneys do. I'm an attorney, so I understand they're trying to mitigate liability.
Sure.
But generally speaking, I have heard from, all the stakeholders involved that they are trying to do the right thing here and make that data available. And they've all, even like some of the the associations for developers are even taking steps focusing on what data is in the designated record set and things like that. So a lot of good things I've been hearing actually
Yeah,
out there for compliance.
it's good to hear.
Mhm.
And so now the rule, is out. Its enforcement date is passed. So what's next for ONC?
Well, I'll tell you what, I've been here 12 years. It's never slowed down.
Yeah.
I always talk to some of my colleagues who've been here just as long, and I was like, there was that one time we might have had a space, and then we did what ended up being like, I don't know if you remember this, but it's called the voluntary edition of certification criteria. It ended up becoming the 2014 edition release too.
Uh-huh.
But like that was the only window when we never did anything. And I remember, um, you know, oh, what's going to happen after high tech? Well, then Cures came along, right? And so
Right.
I think even when we finish with Cures, which is there'll be something else. But to answer your question, there's still a lot. One, there's like I think three areas, right? Finishing what we have to do in Cures. A couple things just to name right off the top of my head. There's the EHR reporting program we're working hard on. There's a trusted exchange framework and common agreement, also
Mhm.
contextually known as TEFCA,
Yep.
working hard to get that implemented. In both those cases, Congress specifically said you had to do certain actions through rulemaking. So we'll actually be doing some rulemaking around those in the future. I think the second area is our new administration, a lot of new
Yep.
executive orders. We're looking at those. How does the ONC play a role in that, particularly like with health equity? What can we do through certification or other things related to health IT to improve equity amongst all patients? And so, and particularly the areas that are who've, I think, not seen the same level of care, right? Certain racial and economic groups. And so we're doing studies there. We're also looking at our certification program. What can we do in that space? Um, I'm sure you're familiar with the vaccine, rollout and next steps there. I think we're doing what we can from what, our expertise is, which is focusing on coordination. That's in our name. And so we
Yep.
do that in the department and we do that with other federal agencies when it comes to health IT. So that's part of our role right now. And then I think our bread and butter is interoperability, right? So whether that goes to, the vaccination and steps going forward there, or if that's to, our program, or just generally if other agencies are trying to get more data and how they get that to each other, whether particularly in public health, when I talk about vaccination, like standardizing that process, we're trying to provide our expertise there. We're working with what they're called standard development organizations. We're working with our Health IT Advisory Committee. We stood up a couple task force, one on that USCDI. I mentioned what type of data should always be there for available
Right.
for access. We had one on, it's called ICAD, which is like the, if I can remember this, intersection of clinical and administrative data task force. So once again, looking at how do you make that interoperable? How do you, make that data more accessible? So I think those are kind of where we're at. There's always going to be a lot to do. There's, the new administration priorities and objectives that we're going to focus on implementing. A lot of executive orders there. Bread and butter on interoperability, strategic plan, rolling that out, and then still some cure stuff, and obviously implementing this rule. It's a big rule, like you
Sure.
pointed out. I think there's a lot of questions, a lot more guidance that we maybe be able to provide. So I think we're going to continue to engage stakeholders with educational resources, with presentations, with those frequently asked questions, and then we'll see what kind of complaints come in and see, um,
Sure.
what we need to do in that space too.
Well, and it makes sense you do the interoperability with Mickey Tripathy as the new national coordinator. That makes sense that he would continue pushing that forward after all his history. So,
Yep.
uh, excellent. Well, I appreciate you taking the time to share some insights. This was really interesting to hear some of the back end process stuff that many of us aren't as privy to. So, thanks so much for taking the time to share, Michael.
Thank you. I really enjoyed the opportunity to talk about our work and the conversation, and I'd be happy to come back any other time you want me to. So thank you.
Awesome. And thanks everyone for watching. If you want to find more great healthcare IT content like this, be sure to check it out at healthcareittoday.com. Thanks, Michael.
Thank you.